We have a new NBA champion. Congratulations to the Oklahoma City Thunder on winning the franchise's first championship since the franchise moved to OKC from Seattle 16 seasons ago. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 48 Minutes podcast from Believe. I'm Bruce Bernstein, along with Michael Worldby Freer. We're joined this week by my good friend and friend of the show, Dave Wohl. If Dave's NBA resume were a box score, he'd have numbers in every key column. Dave played 7 NBA seasons. Jerry West called him a pest. Dave also was a head coach, an assistant GM, a general manager, and even the executive vice president of basketball operations for the Miami Heat in the years that Heat culture was, becoming a thing. Welcome back to 48 Minutes, Dave.
Thanks, Bruce.
So, all right, let's get started. Sunday night's Game 7 of the NBA Finals. Dave, what was your overall impression of the series between the Thunder and the Pacers?
I thought it was a terrific series. These are, the point I've made when I've talked with other people too is these teams are really young teams. OKC, I think, might have been the youngest in the league. But even if you look at Indiana, and it was a shame that Haliburton got hurt, obviously, but they're basic 8 or 9 best guys are in that 22 to 27, 28 range. I mean, the Pacers have Tim McConnell at 32, Siakam at 30, and they're still making big contributions. Caruso's at 30 he's like the old man at OKC. So I think there's a great chance you see these teams in the future sometimes at the same place. I thought it was a great, well played. They played hard. They really competed. There was no let up. Nobody got, like, if you were down 10 or 15, nobody kind of just folded. So, and it was 2 small market teams. So I thought it was a great series.
Yeah, I agree, Dave. I thought it was a tremendous series. Indiana was pegged as the great underdog. And I mentioned this before, while they're in their seed, they were underdog or whatever. I mentioned this before that since the beginning of January, best records in the league were Oklahoma City, Cleveland, Boston, and then Indiana. Yeah. So it's not if they snuck up on teams or on people, that's their own fault because this team was really on a roll by the time they got to the playoffs, and they had one of the all-time runs to the postseason because of Haliburton's dramatics there in every series. So it was a lot of fun to watch them go along. And as you mentioned, Dave, this could possibly be for the next few years. This could be the worst that we've seen Oklahoma City. I mean, it's possible this is the worst team of the next few years. We're going to get, the version of Oklahoma City.
Yeah, I think, you can't pat Sam Presti on the back enough because Oklahoma City isn't back for 12 years. That was the last appearance they had in the finals. And a lot of times now there's pressure from ownership. When you're a good team or you have a choice to either rebuild or just add stars, the pressure from ownership is add stars so we can get back up there. And I thought Sam did a phenomenal job being patient, building, making shrewd trades, good drafting, picked up free agents like a Caruso or Dort, I think, guys like that. And, and he developed this kind of team. I don't know what you want to call it, but they all seem to be on the same wavelength. They all seem to be pretty good guys. They get together. And I think they recognized once they got into the season, they had a chance to do something special. And Michael, like you said, I think Indiana finished the season 16-3. They announced we're here when they smacked Cleveland out of the first round. So it wasn't really a surprise to me. And the thing I love about Haliburton is, if you go back to when he got drafted, a lot of people didn't even think he'd be good enough to play in the NBA. And now he's just winning. He was winning games with these special shots and moves. I was just sitting and laughing in my chair, showing just, how much the draft is more art than science a lot of times.
It's funny. There was a lot of press when I guess there was some sort of a poll of NBA players of who's the most overrated guy in the NBA? And Haliburton was voted that by the players around the league. I mean, they look like a bunch of fools.
Yeah, it just goes to show you too that a guy like Haliburton, the thing I admire about guys, Caruso's another one, McConnell's another one, they don't pay attention to what the outside noise is. They know who they are. They know what they're going to try and do. They have the grit or the competitiveness. They know what their weaknesses are. They work on their strengths. And these are the guys that exceed, the levels that people kind of try and put them at. So I always love watching those guys. McConnell was, I thought, phenomenal. He's been great for the Pacers. Dort, Oklahoma City finds Dort, and he becomes just this great defender. Can't shoot when he first comes in, and he's knocking down threes in the playoffs. So it's really fun to watch growth, not only from a team standpoint or an organization standpoint, but from an individual player standpoint. And take their coach. I mean, he comes up from the G League team. He looks calm as anything on the sidelines, and he leads his team after, 2 years into the finals and the title.
Hey, Dave, this is kind of a weak pivot on my part, but we mentioned Haliburton. We mentioned his injury briefly here. We had in the playoffs, we had the same injury to Damian Lillard. We had the same injury to Jason Tatum. And now on the day after the finals, because of that injury, a lot of the talk once again is around, should the NBA do something about the season, either the length of games or the period in which they play it in? What's your take on because it seems to come up every now and then, and now it's making a lot of noise. 82 games is too long, which personally I don't understand, just because it's been that way for decades. I don't know why it's suddenly an issue. But what is your take on that?
Well, I think you're not going to see the season be shortened. And that's the money issue, because I will tell you from a player's standpoint, if you told them, we could play 70 games, but you'd have to give back 1% or, $1 million of your salary or some percentage, the players would say, well, what else am I going to do in the summer? I'll go for another month and play the extra 10 or 15 games. So, and I think the owners kind of have the same mentality. The interesting thing about what you said was there were 3 Achilles injuries. And that's strange. It's like having 3 ACLs in a season or something like that. So I don't know from a medical side how we train to stop those kind of injuries, because those aren't a balance, strength. One of the things I've noticed, and I've talked about some, is that the demands of athleticism in the game have increased incredible for the wear and tear on the body. I still don't know if players get enough rest time. I would like to see them take 2 weeks off at the All-Star break. I don't care if they show old footage of great players on TV to keep it alive, but I think everybody should go home, get 2 weeks off, get all your, banged up issues taken care of. Now come back in, get mentally a little better. And I don't think anything like that's going to happen, but I don't think this is something that you can solve. Maybe guys are doing too much in the summers, because on top of everything in the season. There was one guy on one of the radio shows was talking about he wants the playoffs shortened, as if to say, well, okay, they always get injured in the playoffs. No, so a guy could get an Achilles in the regular season, but if you shorten the playoffs, he's going to be okay. It doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so I was on Twitter last night, and Haliburton, Damian Lillard, Jason Tatum, 3 superstar players, 3 Achilles injuries. Is there one other thing that the 3 of those guys have in common? If you don't know the answer, I'll tell you. Can either of you guess what that might be?
Yeah, the jersey number.
Yeah, I read that today.
I thought that was bizarre,
So we should really just ban the number 0 from jerseys. Yeah. Really, we'd be halfway home.
Yeah.
As soon as I saw that, I looked on OKC's roster. I wanted to see if anybody on their roster wore number 0. And I was going to say, you better put him in bubble wrap. But no, there was no number 0 on the OKC.
You know what's interesting about the Achilles injury, too? It usually doesn't come from somebody exploding in something. It's usually they took a step to the side, and even in the general public, somebody who has an Achilles will say, well, I just took a step or 2 and then I fell down. I wasn't trying to run hard or anything. So I honestly don't know. This is where you got to talk to strength coaches or physicians is there certain things we're not doing that could protect the Achilles more? I don't know.
You alluded to this answer a few minutes ago, but I want to ask it a slightly different way here. So Shai Gilgeous Alexander wins the scoring title, wins regular season MVP, and wins finals MVP. That's been done a handful of times. I think I read somewhere he was the third youngest to do it. The youngest was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar when he was known as Lou Alcindor back in 71. But your former team, the Clippers, actually drafted Shai Gilgeous Alexander in 2018, traded him to OKC, along with tons of draft assets after his rookie season in the Paul George deal. Now, one of those draft picks became Jalen Williams, and several others, including two on Wednesday night, are still going to confer to OKC. So listen, just let the record show you had nothing to do with that trade since you had left the team the year before. But was that trade truly Sam Presti's master class in how to build a team?
I think you'd have to go back and look at a lot of the trades that Sam did, because sometimes he got 2 draft picks for a guy, and those draft picks, how he used them, or did he take a player with them? And then what did he do with that player over the last 12 years? I can defend the trade that the Clippers made in the sense that at that time, Paul George was looked at as a top player. He wasn't top 10 or top 15. Kawhi was looked at as a top 5 player. Steve Ballmer, and Steve's been a great guy, great owner. He just didn't want to rebuild once we had decided we have to break up the CP3, and that trio. And so the question is, do you try and rebuild with draft picks? Do you try and keep any young player that you have who you think is going to really become a star? Or do you make a trade like that? And we'll never know if the trade would have gone the other way had Kawhi and Paul stayed healthy, obviously. I think Clippers fans sit there sometimes go, oh, God, if we'd had Kawhi and Shai, oh, my God, we'd be so good. But don't forget, Shai at the time was like a 12-point-a-game scorer. And I really liked him in the middle of the scouting season. I thought this kid was going to be the best point guard in the draft and a terrific NBA player, but not the Shai that scores 30 a game and MVP level, So my question is always, did Sam just get lucky on this one because Shai was the best guy he could get thrown in? Or did Sam spot something, in Shai that he said, well, if I get this guy, he's going to average 30 a game. And the Jalen Williams thing is like the cherry on top of the cake. So,
yeah. All right. So on any other day, let's move on now. Congrats to the OKC. We'll watch the parade, and whenever that takes place, that's always fun for the fans. So on any other day, we'd be starting with our next story. That would be Kevin Durant is now a member of the Rockets. Phoenix sends the 37-year-old future Hall of Famer to Houston for Jalen Green, Dillon Brooks, the number 10 overall pick in Wednesday's draft, and 5 second-rounders. Now, Green is a talented but really inconsistent guard, and he'll need to coexist with Devin Booker and Bradley Beal if all 3 are on the roster next season, and who knows if that will be the case. And, of course, Durant is still a top 2-way player. We all know what he brings to the team. So, Dave, the Rockets finished second behind OKC in the West this past season, but there was a 16-game gap between the two teams. How much has Houston closed that gap, if at all?
I like this trade. I didn't think Houston might do this because they were on a nice arc of moving up and everything, and had established an identity and everything else. But once the trade went down, and I thought about it more, this was a good trade for them, maybe a great trade, because what they really needed, they needed scoring, shooting, a guy who could create his own shot. Now, we worry about the age again. Kevin's going to be 37 at the start of next season. And if they sign the 2-year extension they're expecting that he wants, he's going to be there till he's 39. But they've decided we're going for it now. And the real loss, I thought, and they'll make up for it in some ways, obviously, was losing Brooks, because I thought he brought a defensive identity. And I think he had his best year shooting threes. I think he shot 39% or something. But, Amin Thompson became, a much better defender. Sengun is growing. They played Steven Adams with Sengun, and I think their plus minus was incredible. So they're adding Kevin to a mix where his 25 a game or something like that, I think, is going to win more games for them. So I thought it was a great trade overall. I don't think other than Brooks, I don't think they gave up anything that they're not going to go, oh, boy, I wish we had him back.
Dave, do you think before I ask you about the Suns, do you think it was did the Rockets just give up on Jalen Green, just decide he was never going to be that shooter that he's got so much other ability, he's got so much athleticism, and he just can't shoot the ball with any sort of consistency? Did they just, I know they got Kevin Durant, but did they just give up on Jalen Green, say he's not going to be that player?
I think you hit it on the head, Michael. He's just not a consistent shooter, not a consistent scorer. And look, if you look at the way Kevin Durant's able to play and you look at Green, you're really saying, I need what Kevin can give me now. We're not going to get there if I have to wait 2 or 3 more years for Green to become a consistent shooter. Green is probably never going to become a Kevin Durant level player, at least in my opinion. He may become a very good NBA player, great starter. I just don't think he's ever going to become Kevin Durant level. And so their gamble is Kevin stays healthy, because I think, he's only played over the last 7 years. He's only played an average of 46 games a year. Now, he played 62 this year and 75 the year before. But he's had a couple injuries and he's 37. So, a lot of it will depend on the trainers and their management team of how they take care of their guys down there. They probably want to cut some of his minutes down a little bit, but I think in the thing I thought he might go to was Miami, because I thought Miami really needed a third star. They had Adebayo, they have Hero, they don't have another guy, and they need shooting and scoring. I thought this was the one place that he would fit in perfectly, but I guess they just didn't want to give up some of the things that Phoenix wanted. So it turns out to be a good deal for Houston.
Boy, you, not to make light of this, but the minute Haliburton went down, Miami is probably wondering, geez, did we miss the boat there by a few hours? Because, the East is going to be, you figure, considerably wide open that season. But I want to ask you from the Suns standpoint now. We talked about the Rockets, what Kevin Durant brings to them. Where are we at with the Suns here? Because this move was obviously based in large part on salary because of their salary situation. But I was reading today some a chart or whatever, and they're still not. They can't possibly be done yet, because they're not only over the first apron, they're right now projected to be over the second apron, which is by what everybody says is the nail in the coffin for your franchise for a good decade potentially. Where do they go from here?
I think they're clinging to a third apron, actually, and they're trying not to get over that one. They're trying to hide that one. I agree with you, Michael. I think their salary situation is very difficult because of all the restrictions. Once you get at the first apron and then you get to the second and over the second, I mean, you can't aggregate. You can't do other things. It just makes it really hard, where you might end up just signing a lot of minimum players or players that really, are not going to help you that much. I think that team's had 3 coaches in 3 years. And I thought their biggest mistake was firing Monty Williams at the beginning. But I think they got a new owner that came in. He was in a rush to have a lot of success. He thought everybody loved his roster. I guess he wasn't as familiar with what restrictions the money would be. So I think they're stuck for a while, unless they can start trading guys and they decide, all right, I'm going to trade Booker, I'm going to trade, Beal, I'm going to trade everybody, and we're starting over like OKC. I'm going to follow the OKC model. We're going to get a lot of draft picks and we'll go from there.
Okay, let's turn to the story of the New York Knicks front office, also known as the Keystone Cops, who have turned themselves into laughingstocks as they look to replace head coach Tom Thibodeau, who was fired at the end of May. In addition to looking like a bunch of amateurs, the Knicks put 5 different franchises in a tough spot regarding their own coaching situations by asking to speak with their currently employed coaches. Now, Dave, given how important relationships are amongst the 30 teams, general managers, et cetera, the Knicks seem to have torched a lot of those relationships. What can their management do to restore those relationships, if anything?
That's a good one, because not being part of the phone conversations, there's a way to ask. I mean, if you have somebody and you're interested in him, I had to do it when we were looking for a coach before in Miami, when I was the GM, before we got Pat to take over. I talked to Golden State because Rick Adelman was there, and I'd been a teammate of Rick's in Portland, so I knew Rick. And Rudy Tomjanovich, I'd been a teammate of Houston's, and Rudy was in Houston. I asked if we could talk with them about the coaching position, and they gave me a polite no, but it didn't bother any relationship I had with either the two guys or the team. So I don't know if you never know what the conversations had. Did they come on like, you got to let us talk to them, or there's going to be trouble, or we won't find tickets for you when you come to New York? I don't know, but it shouldn't have ruined any relationships. In fact, it's a tribute kind of to the team that you have a coach that other teams value. And I think all those teams that they talked to had coaches that are doing well in each team's situation, and they weren't going to let go. I thought it was a little naive to think that they were going to let them go. And now, because it just doesn't sound like they had a plan. Usually if you're firing a guy, you have one or two names that are available that you can go after, and you go sign a guy relatively quickly. But now I don't. And whoever they sign now knows he's like the sixth guy, the sixth choice. So it was like, you kept asking the woman to marry you, and she kept saying no. And, all of a sudden the person she said yes to is the sixth guy that asked, so I don't know what they're going to end up with. And, everybody's wondering why they fired Thibs in the first place. So, it's a difficult, I think, management situation to come out of.
Now, Dave, while we talk about the Knicks and the embarrassing situation they're in, they're still entering next season. Them and the Cavaliers at this point would be considered the front runners all of a sudden in the Eastern Conference, which, because of injuries, we all know that is going to be about as wide open as any I can remember in recent memory. I mean, it's just really, you could pick about 4 or 5 teams right now, obviously in June, as a team that could come out of the East. I'm just curious here. Do you think it's better? The West is the dominant conference. We know that with the top-heavy teams. Is it better for the league in terms of interest to have a team like Oklahoma City, which has potentially a chance to dominate this league the way the Warriors did a few years ago, and the Bulls of the 90s? Is it better to have that kind of a dominant team, or is it better to have a situation like where you expect out East, where you could have 4 or 5 teams in serious contention for that East?
It's a good question, because I think there are probably some fans that like maybe having a new champion or a new battle. I grew up as a kid, the Yankees were dominant. I was a Yankee fan. The Celtics in the 60s and 70s were dominant. I liked people going against the dominant and dynasty. And when I was with the Lakers in the 80s, the Lakers, I think, got to the finals either 8 out of the 10 years of the 80s or 9 times. They won 5. They were a dynasty. Boston was relatively close to a dynasty. I think fans love dynasty matchups. They were hoping somebody beat the Warriors, or they loved the Warriors and they were hoping the Warriors could win another one. So I'm not as big on this parity where you have a new possibility of a champion every single year. I would love OKC to start a dynasty. I would love to have them to have great finals against, terrific opponents trying to knock them down off the mountain. Because I think that's where fans really get engaged. I think if you have a different one each year, fans don't kind of correlate all that as easily. But that could be just me,
So you worked with Tom Thibodeau in Boston. Yep. So you have some considerable insight on what he's all about. And I heard Taj Gibson, who played for Thibs on 3 different teams on NBA radio the other day, and he was saying that, contrary to what a lot of people think, Thibs really is considered a player's coach. Now, I think that may have hurt him a little bit when Josh Hart asked to come off the bench against the Pacers, and he agreed. Now, do you think that management may have lost confidence in his leadership when it emerged that Hart had actually told Thibs to make the move? And had Hart's role in the decision not been made public, would that have been better for Thibs as far as dealing with his bosses?
I'll tell you a great story Satch Sanders told me when I was with the Celtics as an assistant coach. Satch told me he went up to Red Auerbach after his first year or two, and he said, Red, I really need to start. I can score. I don't have to be just defender. I can really score. And Red said, oh, okay. And he started him. And Satch was scoring okay, but they started losing games. And so finally, Satch came up to Red after a while and he goes, I need to go back to coming off the bench. That's what I do best. I don't think that example, I think that's a great example of listening to a player, because sometimes you have to know that the player can accept a different role. And I think Thibs knew Josh Hart well enough, and maybe he was just waiting for Josh to recognize it too, that he could be better coming off the bench. Thibs is really a very, very good NBA coach. I had a couple of years with him in Boston, hard worker. He's a good guy. Players genuinely like him. I think if the Knicks were going to let him go, it should not have been about player communications or too many minutes, because one of the counters to all those minutes is they play at the slowest pace in the NBA. And if you compare some of the minutes of other teams, they don't quite have as many in the high 30s, but they almost have about the same mix of guys off the bench for 25 or whatever it is. I think the other ammunition that, if you really were looking for an argument about Thibs, is he was lucky to beat Detroit in the first round. Except for that blown call by the officials in Game 4, where I think Hardaway would have made at least probably 2 out of those 3 shots, the series would have been 2-2. They went back. Detroit won Game 5. Now Detroit's up 3-2 instead of it being 3-2 New York. So they could have lost the Detroit thing. Boston was hilarious because Boston missed, 75 threes in the first 2 games. Had Boston just shot 5 or 6% below what they normally shoot, they would have beat the Knicks in both those games by double figures, because the games were, I think, 1 and 3 points that they won. So then he gets to the third round and they get beat. But I think the other 2 rounds were more, if you were really looking for ammunition, that would have given you at least more than plays the players too much, or, he's not liked by players or doesn't communicate well, because Thibs has a good personality. Guys like him as a person.
Hey, Dave, now on the other coast, we have the Lakers situation, and it was announced last week, the Buss family is going to sell the Lakers for a reported $10 billion to the gentleman who owns the Dodgers there, Mark Walter. And you won a ring back with the Lakers in 1985 as an assistant under Pat Riley. And given the mom and pop nature of the organization under the Buss family, what do you think the corporate ownership group, what does it mean for the Lakers as far as the franchise going forward?
It even though it was considered a mom and pop back then when I was there, it was really very, very professional, because you're talking about that dynasty in the 80s. You had, Dr. Buss obviously was the owner, and he wanted to win championships every year. So the whole atmosphere was about getting to the finals and winning. You had Jerry West, who in my mind is the all-time great GM, player, coach. I don't care how many titles you want to give him or in terms of jobs. You had Bill Sharman there for a while. You had Pat Riley as the coach. We had, I don't know, in the finals with the Celtics in 84-85, I think between those 2 teams, there were like 9 or 10 guys who are now in the Hall of Fame. So we had a lot of Hall of Fame players. I think there were times where when Jeanie Buss was in control, when Phil was there, they won some things, but now they had also a romantic attachment. And I think when Phil left, he still had a voice with Jeanie in some ways. And I don't think they had a Jerry West. I like Rob Pelinka. I think he does a very good job. But I think they missed the professionalism of Jerry West and Mitch Kupchak and guys like that who are making basketball decisions. And I think that's what eventually they will get back to. I think they'll involve, obviously, Rob Pelinka, but I think they're going to look at each department and say, where do we need to upgrade? What aren't we doing with this department? What other resources do we need? Because it's the same thing Steve Ballmer did when he came in with the Clippers for that paltry $2 billion price, that everybody screamed at him, you're stupid, you're out of your mind. Why would you pay $2 billion for a franchise? And based on the Laker evaluation, Steve's is probably worth 5 or 6 right now.
So Jeanie is still going to represent the team on the board of governors. So, she'll still be kind of a front-facing base, if you will, for the league, which I think is good. Jeanie's somebody that everybody who's ever met her really likes her and respects her, and she seems like a person of honor. So, I'm sure, she and her brothers and the Buss family, they'll have a good time divvying up that money. And so speaking of money, I mean, the league's talking about expansion. They're talking about possibly Las Vegas, Seattle. Your buddy Rick Welts, I know, has been working on the whole Seattle thing. And if any city deserves to have a team back, it's Seattle, particularly after watching the old Sonics win the championship on Sunday night. So, given $10 billion for the Lakers, $6 billion for the Celtics, want to throw out any ballpark figures as to what the entry fee might be for those two teams?
Well, I think this kind of blew it open because I think prior to these two numbers, I think Phoenix had paid the most. It was $4 billion and something. And so I think the rumors or what everybody talked about was the league probably felt pretty comfortable. They could ask for $5 million as an entrance fee for each expansion team. $5 billion, I'm sorry. Now, I mean, I don't know how you can ask for a $10 billion plus entry fee or a set, above $6 billion, $8 billion, you cut the middle, because I just don't know, because teams, investors that have their 5 set up, all of a sudden now got to go out and get a whole nother couple $1 billion investors to join them. So it makes it a little more difficult. And I know there's probably enough teams that are interested beyond Seattle and Las Vegas. So I don't really know how they resolve this or what number they land on. Because if you're still keeping it at 5, well, there's some franchises probably beyond Boston that are moving past 5 right now based on the Lakers valuation. I don't know if the Celtics go from 6 to 8 now based on the Lakers valuation. It's crazy numbers right now.
Hey, Dave, real quick, are you a fan of the potential for expansion with the NBA, or does it not matter to you, or what do you think it does for the league?
I spent 3 years, the first 3 years with the Miami Heat as an assistant coach for their expansion team. I loved it. I should say that. I loved it and hated it. It was kind of like golf almost, because at one point, Ron Cupp, who's passed away, the trainer, Ron and I were looking at it. We had on a whiteboard, we were 5-42, almost 50 games into the season. And we were looking at the schedule, trying to figure out where our next win was going to come from. But the wonderful thing about expansion teams is you don't have any bad traditions. You get to set your own traditions right from the beginning. And in Miami, one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to be the team that was in the best condition. And we were the first team back then that had a summer program to develop players. Now everybody has one. But we were the first team that players came in 4 days a week. We worked with the coaches, and then the strength coach would take them. We'd go out to lunch to build some relationships. And obviously, when we hired Pat, Pat had been that way his whole career with the teams he was with. So he took that to a whole nother level. But I love the expansion team because everybody you hire as much for their personality, their drive, their willingness to join this endeavor that has no guarantee of success. I think I've told this story about Erik Spoelstra. Erik came in to apply for the head video coordinator. And I was just buried in work at the time. I think my interview with him might have been 15 minutes, 18 minutes. And I ended up hiring him. I didn't hire him because I thought he was going to be a great video coordinator. And I didn't hire him certainly because I thought he was going to become one of the great coaches in the history of the league. I hired him because I liked the person that was sitting in front of me. He had some great ideas. He was so eager to do this that we needed people like that in the beginning. So I think expansion teams are great, and especially in these two cities. Seattle was a terrific city to play in when you came in as a visiting team. Las Vegas has been the summer league capital for years. So I hope those two cities get it at a reasonable price.
Dave, we mentioned it a little bit earlier. Coming up in a few days is the NBA draft right after the finals here on Wednesday. And we want you to put your general manager's hat back on here and talk about a few of the bottom feeder teams, if you will. until not necessarily from a drafting standpoint, but where do they go? How do they fix their situation? And we'll start with the Utah Jazz. You worked with Danny Ainge. They're picking number 5 and later on at number 21. What do you think his goals should be on Wednesday night?
I think Danny's team is just going to continue to build. I don't think Danny has any stars on his team. By stars, I'm talking, top 20 players in the league or things like that. They have a good base of some guys. Some guys didn't play a lot of minutes last year, too, whether it was due to injuries or whatever. I think Danny, even when he was in Boston, he was very, very good at kind of building. And then when he thought the time was right to go get a star or two or try and make a deal in the draft, he's got a lot of draft picks that he can play around with. So I think Danny's still on that slow building road, develop the guys we have that have shown, the ability to play in this league. And that's where I think he's gonna stay for a year or two.
Now, the Washington Wizards, who seem to be perennial bottom feeders, I think it's been almost 50 years since they've had a 50-win regular season, believe it or not, which is like mind-boggling. But, they're the Wizards. They're going to pick at number 6, and they're going to pick at number 18. And I know the coach that they hired prior to last season is known as a player development guy. So what should their strategy be?
Well, I think one thing you have to think about, Michael Winger, who is now the president of all their sports, but Michael was with the Clippers as the GM there. Michael worked for Sam Presti in Oklahoma City. I think the GM they have there worked for Sam Presti. I could be wrong on that. And I think Brian Keefe, the coach, might have spent some time in Oklahoma City. I think they're going to continue to use the Oklahoma City model as their guide. They're not going to be in any rush. I think they will draft potential talent over need. They want, we need a point guard. Yeah, but the small forward that we already have, this guy is going to be great. I think that the talent is what they're going to be looking for and develop that talent. And I think they don't have we got to be here or there in 2 years. So I think they'll follow that Sam Presti model.
Now, Dave, to your point, what you just mentioned about following Oklahoma City's model, is it different when you're in a bigger market like DC and you're in out east where, there's a lot of sports teams there? Obviously, there's a big following, as opposed to, I don't want to say being stuck in Oklahoma City. That's not really the right way to put it, but there's a big difference in terms of attention, I think, where Oklahoma City was going through this, and then where you are in D.C. when you have a baseball franchise, MLB franchise, NFL franchise, NHL, not to mention just up the road in Baltimore. Is it easier or not easier? Is it more difficult to follow that model when you're in a situation like in a market like Washington, D.C.?
I think there's two parts to that. One is, what kind of pressure are you getting from the owner? If the owner recognizes that taking a longer time to build, and maybe it's not the 12 years that Oklahoma City went through, but I think what the owner can do is he can take that pressure off you and let you make good decisions is one. And two, I think you have to sell it too. You have to sell, we're going to be younger, we're drafting, we're going to have this exciting, athletic team. I mean, you try and sell it, you get your guys out in the community a little more. And I think people, if they watch you play hard, and that's the biggest thing, if they watch you compete, even if you're losing games, I think people can buy into that without having the expectations of, they're not going to win 50 games this year. So I think it's twofold. If the owner says, hey, just build it to last, rather than build it for a year or two that we go up to maybe the Western Conference Finals and we never get any further, and then we got a bunch of old guys and the money is killing us and we're over the second apron.
Now, Dave, sticking with our bottom feeder theme, my Hornets team I followed for years when I lived in the area, they're picking number 4. There's no more Jordan. We're years removed from Jordan selling the team, so his fingerprints are fading out with every year that passes. But they're not getting, they're not getting any closer to being a team that we saw back in the 90s from Charlotte. Where do they go from here?
They've missed the playoffs the last 9 years. They've missed the playoffs 18 out of the last 21 years. This is a team that confuses me. I don't know what the philosophy is behind them, because if you miss the playoffs for 9 years, you're not even kind of rebuilding in a smart way. They have a couple talented players. They've got Melo, they've got Brandon Miller, Bridges, and Mark Williams as center. So I would suspect, I could be way off, I would suspect they draft for a position. They got 4 guys who are basically going to be their starters. Do they need to find one more to be the other starter? But they don't have an identity. There's something missing in how they're approaching getting back to a rising team in the standings. And I honestly don't know what it is.
So New Orleans will pick at number 7, but who they pick may be less important than what they do with the number 1 overall pick from 2019. I'm trying to think of the guy's name, but he never plays. I mean, what's going on in NOLA?
Well, first of all, I think they might have been the team with the most injuries this year. So that was devastating enough. And Zion was one of those guys that was injured. And I think the whole thing, and again, I don't have any inside information, but they have to make a decision on Zion. What are they going to do with him? The guy rarely plays. He gets hurt. The one year I think he played 70 games. They did much better. He puts up good numbers for his 30 games. Do they trade him? Do they have to start a different training program with him? Do they see how the year's going and try and trade him in mid-season? Because I think he's the linchpin. And I think for him, even as someone they want to trade, what would you get for him? Would somebody give you 4 draft picks and 1 or 2 decent players? Would somebody say, oh, no, he's hurt all the time, I don't want to risk anything, and they don't give him much? Could one of those teams we just talked about, Utah, Washington, or one of the others decide, hey, we'll give you a bunch of draft picks for him, and we'll take him to our team and just see if we can develop him, with the rest of our guys, because we're not in a rush. Would Washington try and do it? So I think this whole thing really revolves around how they figure out what they're going to do with Zion to be able to keep him healthy and play. And if they don't think he can be that, then I think they probably have to move him.
Now, one team that is a bottom feeder in record only are the 76ers, because they're really not. They were supposed to be one of the contenders in the East last season at this time, entering last season. But you talk about injuries to the Pelicans. I mean, nobody suffered worse, I don't think, than from the injury bug than the 76ers. Losing Paul George at the start of the year, losing Joel Embiid. And where is their situation? They're picking number 3, but where is their situation? How do they become back to being contenders again?
I think the biggest thing is they've got to become healthy. And this may be harder than it looks. You have Joel Embiid, who I think the most games Joel has ever played in his career is 68. But lately he's been injured the last few years, even his last year with Doc as their coach. So, how many games is he going to be able to play? Maxey was hurt this year, only played 52 games. Paul George played about 40. Oubre was hurt. I mean, they had guys that would have been in their starting 8 probably, even the one rookie I think they had, McCain, got hurt. So I think the difficulty for them is they need talent, and hopefully young talent, which they're going to have to find in the draft. And they may have to try and make some trades. But if Embiid's not okay after this operation, if Paul George can't play, like his level of play, I still think they're stuck in the, 12 to 15 range.
Dave, you mentioned, you talked about how injured they were, Embiid being injured and everything. I'm just thinking about it. Obviously, Tatum played in the Olympics, and he ended up being injured at the end of the year. Haliburton played at the end of the year in the Olympics. At the end of the year, he was injured. And Embiid was, who knows if he was ever healthy when the Olympics began. Did the Summer Olympics last year play any role, do you think, in all this? You talked about overuse, overworking during the summer. Did that have any factor in any of this? Or is it just coincidental?
That might be coincidental in my mind. I'll give you a better example, I think, of where all the work in the summer can get to a player health-wise. Let's say at the end of the season, you have a lot of guys. And I'm going to use KD as an example here. KD's had a couple of leg injuries. KD's, from what everybody says, was a very hard worker in the summer. He'd take, a couple of weeks off, and then he's in the gym 4 or 5 days a week. He's probably getting up, 200 shots a day, maybe. So think about that. He's getting 200 shots a day, 5 days a week, 1,000 shots a week, 4,000 shots a month. Let's say it's July, August, and September. So all of a sudden he's taking 12,000 shots in the off season. He's in his 10th season. I don't know where that might have slowed down, but he's taking probably over 100,000 shots in the offseason, which is so much more than the shots he's taken in his career in 82 games and the practices. So I don't know how much the kinetic chain, even if he's just taking jumpers without any defenders on him, there's still that kinetic chain, foot, ankle, knee, hip, how much that gets affected by all that extra work. And is there a better way to cut down on that motion and find other motions? Like Kareem used to do yoga, used to do other things, more of that balances the body out. I know a lot of the strength coaches try and do that, but is taking all those shots, especially when you're young guys. They want young guys in the gym for hours. Guys will say, hey, I got up 500 or 1,000 shots a day. And I'm like, oh, geez, I hope you don't do that tomorrow. Give them a day off in between or something. But, and I don't have anything to prove by it, but I know that they're doing so much work because guys want to get better. But how much does that affect you along the way? I just don't know.
So we're about to wrap up this special episode of 48 Minutes because you're here, Dave. So go up to your 30,000-foot view of this past season. Any kind of overall thoughts as we kind of kiss this season goodbye and get ready for the summer league? Anything that really stood out to you, or just any thoughts that you have about the season that just passed?
Yeah, I thought it was a season of change, and not only change for this year, but change for next year with all the injuries. Boston's going to be different next year for a while. Indiana's going to be different. The two young teams, Indiana and OKC, all of a sudden wrap up a great finals. I think everybody looks at Indiana in a different way now. Cleveland was the toasted league, the first probably 3/4 of the league, but what happened to them in the playoffs? I think it was a wonderful, throwing the dice out, and there's all these numbers all of a sudden laying on the floor that are going to get accentuated going into next year. There's a lot of pressure on some teams to do better or to go further in the playoffs. So that was my take on the season. A lot of the parts of it were really fun to watch.
World B?
Well, I'll tell you this. I mentioned it at the top of the show where Oklahoma City wins the NBA title, and they're the second youngest team to do so in the shot clock era behind the 77 Blazers with Bill Walton and company, Maurice Lucas and company. Right. And I'd just like to point out once again, just kind of repeating myself from earlier, I know we've had 7 different champs in the last 7 years. Every time they win, we think, oh, here comes a dynasty. Here comes a run by Boston. Here comes a run by Milwaukee when Giannis was at his height. But when it comes to Oklahoma City, I mentioned before, get ready because this might have been the worst Oklahoma City team we see for the next half decade. They're that young, they're that talented, and they have that much assets going forward. This team is not 68 wins, and who knows if they could challenge the magic number 70 in the next few years. But this could be the worst Oklahoma City team we've seen in the last half decade.
Well, you know what happens when you win the championship, though. They will have a target on their back 82 times next year. And so they're going to get every team's best shot. Happens all the time when you win the championship. So you may very well be right, but it's not, I'd be really surprised if they go 68-14 next year. Not saying they won't win it. They very well could, but that'll be tough. My final thought has to do with Rick Carlisle. Anyone who has listened to this show over the years knows what a great admirer I am of Rick Carlisle. I worked with him at ESPN. He's a brilliant strategist. He's a great motivator. And I thought what he did with the Indiana team this year was really maybe his best coaching job ever. I know he won a championship with Dallas when they beat Miami, but taking this group and getting them past Cleveland, then past, New York New York, and they had to win every series without home court advantage, and they won all of them. So kudos to Rick Carlisle. I don't think there's any question about it. His ticket to Springfield has been punched, and it's just a matter of when he decides that he's had enough. Anyway, guys, NBA draft is Wednesday night. It's always been my favorite work night of the year. When I was at ESPN, I worked backstage at the draft with David Stern and then with Adam Silver. It was just a magical night because the young men and their families, they watch their dreams come true in real time. It's a night of wonderment and celebration. And next week, we're going to be back here to reflect on it. And Dave Wohl, thank you so much for being a part of this week's 48 Minutes. It's always a treat when you come on. We always appreciate your willingness to share your knowledge and time with our listeners and viewers. So thank you so much. So and
love chopping it up with you guys anytime.
Appreciate it. World B, same to you. Next week, Ross Geiger will be back with us, coming off of his well-deserved week off. So until next week, for Dave and Michael World B. Freer, I'm Bruce Bernstein. So long, everybody.